Dear students and faculty members, dear friends and guests of the American University Kiev, good evening from Eastern Europe and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from across the ocean. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your time and welcome to the AUK Talks, which has become the signature venue for the American University Kiev to gather the top global leaders in diplomacy, politics, military affairs, and academia to discuss the most salient issues of our time. Tonight, it is my distinct privilege and honor to welcome once again, for the second time since the start of the war, a great friend of Ukraine and someone I could call also a mentor and a good friend, Ambassador John Herbst, who is currently the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador Herbst was the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine during the Orange Revolution, and before that he was the U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan. He's had a distinguished career with the U.S. Department of State for over 30 years in many important positions, diplomatic, but also reconstruction, stabilization efforts, the Civilian Response Corps. He's held appointments, as I mentioned, across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, also in Jerusalem, but largely across as an ambassador at large also for the newly independent states after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ambassador Herbst's writings have appeared in many highly reputable journals, newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the National Interest, Foreign Policy, and he's a frequent guest discussing also the Russia's war against Ukraine, both for television and radio channels. Ambassador Herbst earned a bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and also from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, which makes him a member of the so-called Fletcher Mafia, such as myself. So with this, John, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us the second time since, as I said, the start of the war. There are many things we need to unpack, and not that much time, about 45 minutes, as I understand. So, President Biden's inflection point speech, something that that was analyzed by many, including yourself, something that gave a rise to many speculations, to many analyses about the future of American foreign policy, the way America is able or not to handle the support for all our democratic allies across the globe. The U.S. Supporting, of course, Ukraine, Israel lately, and of course Taiwan is always, the threat, the Chinese threat is always looming large. So what do we make out of this? Can America handle, all these competing, often tasks, and of course in the context of the turmoil, let's put it this way, in Washington, and the reduced military aid for the time being? What should Ukraine expect for the future? So the floor is yours.
Okay. Let's start with the speech, since you asked about that. I gave this speech very high marks because for the first time, President Biden pointed out that the United States has a clear, vital interest in making sure Putin loses in Ukraine. He said that, if Putin were to win in Ukraine, we have to worry about defending our NATO allies who were once part of the Soviet Empire. That's a big step forward to explain to the American people why we must provide significant aid to Ukraine. I wish that speech marked a new, clear, persistent effort to make this case to the American public, but I can't say it has. If that were true, then, when he gave that speech 4 weeks ago, we would have heard similar comments from him, from his secretaries of state and defense, from his national security advisor. not new speeches, but some reference to this great stake that we have in this fight. Because if he pushes that hard, if his administration pushes that hard, the American people understand. And we know that support for Ukraine amongst the American public is still a majority, even a good-sized majority, but it's smaller than it had been. And if he pushes this theme in a serious way, that support will begin to rebound.
Can you hear us?
Sorry? Oh, I know, I can hear you.
Yeah.
All right. You want me just to continue, or do you want to ask me other specific questions?
No. I mean, this was just the obviously the intro question, and please
Okay.
proceed with your points that you have identified.
Well, all right. Then I'll talk about the current situation in Washington right now. Without a doubt, this is the most dangerous time since Moscow launched its big invasion. It's the most dangerous time because I have no doubt Ukraine will triumph in this war as long as Western aid continues at substantial levels. And right now, the staying power of Biden's policy is in doubt because Congress, the House of Representatives, at this point has not agreed to additional funding for Ukraine. I think that there's a better than 50% chance that this is going to be solved, but not much better than 50%. You have a very strange situation today. You've got a small minority of Republicans in the House of Representatives, maybe as few as 6, certainly no more than 10, who think it's very important to stop American assistance to Ukraine. They think that because they don't have a clue about our vital interests in Europe and globally, but this is what they think. And they have managed to expel the previous Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and they remain committed to stopping assistance to Ukraine. There are another 25, maybe 30 maximum, members of the Republican Party in the House who will speak the way those 6 to 10 speak, who will vote the way those 6 to 10 vote, but for whom this is not a critical issue. So they are not driving this process. They wanted McCarthy out because they didn't trust him on Ukraine. The new speaker, Mr. Johnson, has given people who understand America's great interest in Ukraine's victory reason for hope. He saw President Biden shortly after he became speaker, and he said the United States cannot leave Ukraine in the lurch, that, in fact, if Putin were to win in Ukraine, we have to worry about our NATO allies. So he endorsed the important logic of President Biden's Oval Office speech. He also said that he would permit an assistance bill to Ukraine to reach the floor. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking with members of Congress and their staff over the past month. I am confident that if a bill is put on the floor in the House of Representatives for aid to Ukraine, and that bill is not coupled with some controversial measure, then that bill will pass and Ukraine will get the aid. And Speaker Johnson does have a reputation, even among Democrats, as a person who means what he says. So I take him at his word. But he made no promises about attachments to that bill. So that's, to me, the key question. We're seeing, this is really very interesting, members of that group that is against aid to Ukraine right now playing games with assistance to Israel in the wake of Hamas's savage attack. And they put a condition on that bill, which the Democrats consider to be unacceptable. They want to take money away from our Internal Revenue Service to give to Israel. The Senate and the White House have let it be known that that is unacceptable, but still that provision is there. Friends of Israel, I don't think, are very pleased about this. And if the small group in the House wants to increase their chances of stopping aid to Ukraine, then what they're doing with aid to Israel is a big mistake, because they're just making more enemies. But this too has to be worked out. So there's a very good chance that the Israel aid bill will be worked out before the Ukraine aid bill gets consideration.
Now, do you see, I mean, obviously there's a tendency, of course, among Republicans to always support Israel by default. So do you see the two bills, when the issue starts getting resolved, as being attached by default, or would it be possible to convince both the speaker and those representatives who are opposed to the aid for Ukraine to actually propose a separate?
On the Israel aid package, the whole Republican Party has united behind this, although again it's driven by this small group, because from a Republican standpoint, partially defunding the Internal Revenue Service is a political victory. But again, since the Republicans only control the House of Representatives, whereas the Democrats control the Senate and the White House, there's zero chance that this will pass. At some point, I suspect the Republicans in the House will recognize that. I'm just not certain when that point is.
Okay. All right. Having the context of the election year next year, a year from now, almost to the day, do you think President Biden is determined to continue pushing for support for Ukraine, again, within the context of all the competing challenges?
I have no doubt that he will continue to push for major support for Ukraine, because our interests demand it, and he genuinely would like to see it. I've criticized his administration for being too slow in sending more advanced weapons to Ukraine, and that criticism still holds, for being too cautious on NATO Ukraine, and that criticism still holds. But their overall policy has at least been adequate by making sure, with all the assistance, with the sanctions, with the isolation of Russia, not just economically, but politically, they have made it impossible for Russia to win. What they have not done is make it possible for Ukraine to win and for Russia to lose. That's a different order of support. So he will continue to push his policy with its good side and its not so good side. The problem, of course, is if the Republicans are able to stall this and it leads to disaster, the Biden administration will also be responsible, because had they armed Ukraine better, the counteroffensive might have had a real breakthrough this year. It would be harder for Republicans to criticize the conduct of the war and our role in it.
Well, let me build up on that and ask you. I mean, our latest conversation took place exactly a year and a half ago in May of 2022, barely 3 months after the war started. And there was already a momentum building, some hopes and expectations that the Ukrainians would start prevailing, that there would be a turning point. And still, you mentioned that the many in DC, many in the US, in the political elite and elsewhere have been disappointed. What, in your opinion, created these unrealistic illusions? I mean, think of how the US Army would have fought. Think of the meager, in some respects, aid that we provide in terms of air support and other systems. That the Abrams tanks didn't even start arriving until September. So, what was the reason that people were fraught with expectations, and then suddenly this disappointment and the way it impacts the current situation?
There are several reasons for this, and I can tell you, people who understood what was happening, who understand what's happening, never made predictions that this counteroffensive on land would have a major breakthrough. I've said since March that given the way we are arming Ukraine, very slowly providing the more advanced weapons they need, at best we should expect was a counteroffensive on land that would achieve a breakthrough, but would liberate several hundred square kilometers of additional territory. And that's what's happened. But the reason why there's been a misconception about what was possible is, first, the administration, even as it refused to give Ukraine the weapons it needed for success, would sometimes background the press expressing their disappointment about the counteroffensive, when their own timidity is the principal reason for the less than spectacular gains on land. So that's one reason. Two, many people who don't understand, again, the military situation well, simply assume that since the Ukrainian offensive last year had great success, this year there'd be great success. Makes no sense, but that's how it is. And it's also true that senior Ukrainians were talking about the prospect for some major success this year. And that was also a mistake. So those are the reasons why people expected more than was reasonable to expect. But there's one point that's also forgotten in this conversation, which I want to bring up. While the results on land have been modest, the results at sea have been spectacular. The Ukrainians, without a real navy, have driven the Russians out of Sevastopol. Russian warships are now hiding in the eastern Black Sea. They are no longer conducting strikes on Odessa from 40 or 50 miles off the coast. They are literally hundreds of miles away. And it's unclear if the Russian Black Sea Fleet is going to come back into this war. So that's a serious victory for Ukraine in the past several months.
That makes it even more impressive, given that it's a country effectively without a navy,
right?
And also given our own analysis and predictions that Russia is going to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake, and as you pointed out, this is far from true now.
The Russians have turned it into a small corner of the lake.
Absolutely. It's all due to Ukraine's creativity and resilience, and the ability to leverage so many new aspects of Navy technology, including naval drones.
Right.
I'm building. I'm seeing a number of great questions built in the chat here. But let me ask you before we move to the Q&A. We have about 20-25 minutes. Let's look at China a little bit. Obviously this much discussed summit and the meeting between Biden and Xi. Biden, made news by calling Xi a dictator right after the summit. It would have been interesting to see if he had done it before the summit, but he did after. And we also Secretary Blinken's face after that. So what does it tell you? So Biden is still ideologically committed to really oppose this axis of dictatorships. He is ready to negotiate on realistic terms with someone like Xi, but at the same time, he's clearly stating that he's really a supporter of democracy worldwide. Is that your read from this exchange?
Power, the world's second largest economy, a major trading power with us. So we have to deal with China. But having moral and strategic clarity in doing so is absolutely essential. So I see this as perfectly sensible. And I don't see any contradictions in Biden's policy. I think what we saw in San Francisco, and this is really interesting, were the first signs in Chinese diplomacy of Chinese weakness since China adopted, the warrior diplomacy that has made it deeply unpopular, and not just in Southeast Asia or not just in East Asia, but in Northeast Europe, in parts of Africa. She was kind of there hat in hand. There's been talk in the United States for years that China was way ahead of us in AI. China was ahead of us in IT. And it turns out that that was not quite so, right? So we began to limit the chip technology or the chips that we were sending to China. And lo and behold, their industry is suffering as a result of it. As a result of aggressive Chinese policy, which both in the economic realm and of course in the political realm, foreign direct investment in China is dropping. That plus the internal Chinese economic woes related both to their aging population and the growing state control over the economy has led to a toxic mix. So again, it's almost seemed like she was there hat in hand, and we haven't seen that look with China in over a decade.
And yet, Russia wasn't mentioned prominently. I'm sure this was a signal also to Putin about the receding relevance of his regime in his country in global affairs.
I'm not surprised that there's no public reference to it, not in a serious way. If my description of the relative balance of power between Xi and Biden in San Francisco is accurate, and there have been other observers who pointed this out, I would hope that Biden had raised with Xi, dropping or diminishing, if not stopping, the flow of Chinese chips into Russia. And some statement, if not maybe beyond that, although I'd be happy with just that, some statement indicating that China really does recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that has an impact on the presence of Russian troops on that territory.
Would it be fair to say that China would be still interested to see the West, and in particular the US, distracted or having a lot of its resources drawn into supporting Ukraine, so to keep its focus away from Taiwan in a way?
I think that Xi is probably of two minds on this question. On the one hand, you're right that China would like the US and the West to be embroiled in Ukraine, but only, of course, and this is very important, their involvement does not lead to a Russian defeat, right? It may well be that Xi, between his own mounting economic and political problems, and as well as the difficult time Moscow has had in Ukraine, is regretting whatever encouragement he may have given Putin when Putin launched the big invasion. But at this point, we have seen no indication of that. And I can't tell you that it's happening. I hope it is, but I can't tell you that it's happening. I just don't know.
Let's look at the other side of the medal, though. Would it be fair also to say that a restored Russian empire or a neo-Soviet empire, whatever Putin may think he wants to get, a Eurasian empire, would also not be in the interest of China to have Ukraine, Belarus kind of forcefully brought back under Russian control?
I think that China looks at this through the lens of its competition with the United States. And your question is a good one, because China does have also what is ultimately going to be a competitive relationship with Russia. So why would they want Russia to be stronger? That's, you might say, is the logic behind your question. But Russia is several orders of magnitude weaker than the United States. And I think that they are not overly concerned about even a Russia that becomes a bit stronger, because even if Russia were to restore much of its empire, it would still be far weaker than China, because Russia does not have a real economy, and China does.
And that's, arguably what matters most in the long term. That's why
Correct.
Biden's administration has been viewing China as the primary strategic threat for the strategic competitor for the U.S.
Look, I understand that in the long run, China is clearly the greater threat. But when you look at current behavior, it's also clear that the immediate danger is Moscow. And it's also clear that one of the most efficient ways to curb Chinese aggression is to defeat Putin in Ukraine.
Absolutely. We couldn't agree more with you on that, especially with my Ukrainian audience.
There's something your Ukrainian audience may know, and if it doesn't, I think it would be very happy to know. We've all heard the name Elbridge Colby, who came up with the idea, I would say it's half-baked, that our great challenger is China. We, the U.S., do not have enough capacity to deal with both China and Russia. Therefore, we need to focus our energies on China. And we all know that Senator Hawley has adopted that point of view too. The only problem with that point of view, besides the fact that it's geopolitically bankrupt, because if you want to deter China from seizing Taiwan, let a strong West ensure that Putin loses in Ukraine. Besides that clear argument, which is why the argument made by Colby should never have had any traction, you have the inconvenient fact that leaders in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan have said that they were all in backing Ukraine because beating Putin in Ukraine is the best way to deter Xi in Taiwan.
Well, these are also important considerations. Let me start grabbing questions from the growing list here. They range from the Middle East, obviously, we've covered China, so we're not going to go back there again, but primarily they're about Ukraine. Let me just take the Middle East from one, because you've served in Jerusalem.
And in Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv, yeah, okay. So
both places.
Yeah. So the question is it true, in your opinion, is it true that Israel may be losing the information war, given how massive the protests in support of Gaza and Palestine are in Europe, in particular? Is there a chance that they win the war on the ground, but then lose the information warfare in the West?
Look, there are, you might say, two constituencies globally where Israel has never done well when there's been violence in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis. One constituency is what was once called the Third World, now called the Global South. The other is amongst hard left Westerners and woke Westerners. So demonstrations of the kind you mentioned were not uncommon in the past, when there have been tensions and conflict, war between Israel and whether it was Palestinians or Lebanese. So that's not really new. But it is true that the growth of hard left thinking on American colleges' campuses has meant even larger demonstrations against Israel here in the US, and for that matter, rise in anti-Semitic incidents, which is truly tragic. I mean, it's awful and it's tragic too. And that has taken some people by surprise, especially since college campuses regularly shut down voices that disagreed with the leftist orthodoxy there, yet they seem to be unable to shut down not just pro-Hamas voices, which they should not shut down, by the way, but even intimidation of Jewish students, which is completely illegal and outrageous at the same time.
Well, these are obviously very complex issues that, and those demonstrations, you're absolutely right. They have additional sources, not necessarily linked to the genuine, genuine affection for the plight of the Palestinian people. Now that we have this kind of covered, let's go back to Ukraine, because the majority of our questions, we have about 15 or 17 minutes before we need to let you go. So one of the questions is pretty straightforward. Why can't the U.S. still give the Ukrainians, that is, the long-range ATACMS missiles over 300 kilometers? What's the showstopper? What's the impediment?
Look, I'm willing to bet that sometime in the next 15 months we will send them. I just don't know when. But the pattern of slow supply of more advanced weapons began even before the big invasion, and it continues to this day. The principal reason for this is that senior officials have been spooked by Putin's nuclear threats. And I think this is a very serious, not tactical mistake, but strategic mistake. The United States has had to deal with nuclear adversaries, for over 70 years. And before this administration, never did senior American officials say publicly that they can't do X or Y or Z in defense of American interests because the Soviet Union might go nuclear. This is a new phenomenon and a very dangerous one, a very naive one. Because if Putin winds up winning in Ukraine because he's threatened us with nukes and we did not send the weapons Ukraine needs to win, he's going to do the same thing with the Baltic states or with Poland or with Romania. The United States is every bit as much a nuclear superpower as Russia, probably more, since I wouldn't be surprised if Russian nuclear capacity shares some of the very clear flaws of its conventional capacity. Yet we've somehow let Putin deter us with his threats. That is not the foreign policy of a superpower. And that is a very sad chapter in the administration's handling of this war.
Let's get a little bit more granular on that issue based on what you know and what you're hearing in Washington. So when I say the administration, is that the president's personal, let's say, fears based on his extensive experience in the Cold War, all these movies about nuclear, and all these images that were going? Is it someone from the advisory circle? Is it someone else that influences?
I can't be certain. This is the policy of the administration, and clearly that's ultimately the responsibility of the president. If in fact this is the president's firm view, then he's not the foreign policy master that he fancies himself. And of course, even if he doesn't agree, even if he's not the reason for this policy, well, then he's still the president, and he should make sure the policy does not include this element. So again, ultimately, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops with the president. But it is a failure, and all it's doing is encouraging China in its own efforts to catch up with the United States and Russia as a nuclear power. So it's actually an attitude and a policy that's promoting nuclear proliferation.
Well, and there's also the propensity of the administration of Biden personally to actually signal very clearly, in clear terms, to our adversary, to Putin, what we will not do. I mean, do you think it's counterproductive when he says
it's part of the same problem?
Yeah.
He should not have said a word about that or a possible American use of troops in Ukraine. Let them worry about that.
Yeah, he should have kept Putin guessing the way Putin keeps the whole West guessing. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Correct. So we're on the same page, yeah.
So the Kremlin is winning the intimidation game, I'm very sorry to say.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. Escalate to de-escalate, that was the name of their game back in the day, and it still holds true, unfortunately. How about the F-16s? People are asking here, do you think they will have a real impact when they're delivered?
if we gave, or we and our allies gave 100, 200 advanced fighters, not just F-16s, you've got the Griffins in Europe, that would have a very positive impact. But by itself, it's not the answer. What Ukraine needs includes F-16s. It includes more tanks. It includes more drones. It includes more sophisticated electronic warfare capacity, and it includes the longer range ATACMS. We give Ukraine all of that in a timely fashion, that will have battlefield impact. And as for the F-16s, I believe a few have been delivered to begin the training of Ukrainian pilots. But as far as I understand it, there are not plans to get even scores of F-16s to Ukraine, say within the next 9 months. So if I had to make a projection, I'd say, maybe by early autumn of next year, there'll be 30 or 40 F-16s in Ukraine, perhaps less.
That's quite a dire picture. I mean, it's 30 or 40 is much better than 3, 4, or 0. But
correct.
The timing,
yes.
Yeah, but the timing, of course, after the spring and summer offensive. Let's look at the role of America's allies. So obviously, you've seen that Germany has announced the doubling of its aid to Ukraine from 4 to 8 billion euros. That's substantial. That's almost unheard of in years past. Do you think our NATO allies in Western Europe, especially those with larger pockets, can substitute, to a certain extent, or fill this gap between we pull all ourselves together and be able to?
I think if American aid is blocked for, say, 6 or more months, there will be an effort by Europe to fill that gap. I think there's a pretty good chance they will, maybe not fully, but largely fill it. But I don't see that continuing. I don't see the Europeans doing that year after year going forward. If only because American leadership has always been essential for security in Europe. And I'm sad to say, but I would expect that if this is where we are 4 or 6 months from now, you're going to see growing Russian provocations against at least bordering NATO states, but maybe even beyond the bordering NATO states, designed to, intimidate the Europeans.
How about if we look at the realm of strategy? There's a question here, actually several of those. What if the US actually possesses a coherent strategy in relation to this conflict? I mean, we don't hear from the administration that we want Putin's regime to fall or that we want Russia to collapse. Yet there are many analysts who actually predict or talk about potential trends. Do you think the administration will have the guts, let's put it this way, to spell out something like that, or is it going to be always balancing?
The possible collapse of Putin's Russia or Russia has become a secondary reason for the administration to hold back on arming Ukraine as it should, which to me is completely without basis and completely contradicts our interests. We don't have a policy of regime change in Russia, and we shouldn't. We've proved incompetent at regime change in the Middle East, so we should have learned something there. We do have a very good record of containing an aggressive Moscow. We should go back to that now. And in going back to that approach, we should explain to the American public that Moscow is a long-term danger to us. The best way to defeat this danger is by arming and sending economic aid to Ukraine. And we spent over $280 billion a year winning the Cold War. By that measure, the $37 billion we're spending in Ukraine, which takes out half of Moscow's conventional military capacity, is a great bargain.
Well, absolutely, and they're doing our job for us. I mean,
yes,
reducing the size of the Russian army. Although we must admit that many, including probably yourself or myself for sure, in the beginning of the conflict, it looked as though casualties in the tens of thousands might make Putin reconsider or might trigger some sort of protest in the Russian society. We're not seeing this happen. Obviously, the Russians are more immune than we thought to such losses.
Look, if it becomes clear at some point that Putin has lost this war, and that could happen, if we arm Ukraine, to break the land bridge, it could happen. But even then, we can't be certain. We do see cracks in the Putin regime. We saw it in the whole Prigozhin affair and the lead up to the Prigozhin affair. It's clear that this war has been a disaster for Russia. It's also clear that many people in Russia, at least at the elite level, understand it. And over time, that is weakening Putin's position. The fact that Prigozhin was not really blocked, did not face serious opposition when he began his mutiny, is a sign of disorder in the regime. So I can't say I'd be surprised if the regime came crashing down, but I'm also in no position to predict that, unless you give me a 40-year window or 30-year window.
Well, we don't have the time machine to look into the future, but we can use historical references and signposts to actually analyze some trends. And you would agree that the Soviet Union collapsed more precipitously than most ever had imagined.
There were a couple of very smart people at the CIA who saw this. A guy named Harry Rowan. You could argue that Reagan understood it, and that was the basis for his policies. But the quote unquote experts, didn't have a clue.
Well, experts in the field of foreign policy and social sciences in general, of course, is not an exact science as we all know.
Correct. It's not a science at all, right?
Absolutely, it's more about art. John, a couple of questions before we need to let you go in about 5 minutes. Do you think there is any interest or appetite in the U.S. To freeze the conflict? Let's say next year, the campaign doesn't yield those results that we expected. Would someone start pushing to freeze the conflict?
There have been rumors for years, even prior to the big invasion, that the administration was interested in this. Actually, administrations, plural, were interested in this, but especially since Biden took over. I can't rule it out, but I also don't think that's what's going on. I know that many people in the administration recognize that Putin has no intention of freezing the conflict. So if you had a quote-unquote ceasefire in place, that would just be a resting point for Putin to regather his strength to come back for the rest of Ukraine later. And I can tell you, when you have naive Westerners, including some who consider themselves experts on Russia, arguing for negotiated peace, Putin sees that as a sign of Western fecklessness and Western weakness. There may well be negotiations to end this war, but I would not be interested in negotiations until I see Putin himself put a serious offer on the table. And a ceasefire in place is not a serious offer.
And he's hardly interested, as you mentioned, in long-term peaceful resolution of anything. So his goals have been clearly set, and we all know that. A couple of interesting questions. What sanctions do you think are significant? What sanctions should have been or should be imposed on Russia?
Look, I believe overall sanction policy has weakened seriously the Russian economy. Not to the point where they have to declare, just to give up. I believe that analyses claiming Russia's economy is growing at 2% or even a little bit more than that are dubious because they're all based on Russian official statistics. That's true of IMF and World Bank analyses. And so to accept those statistics as the basis for real analysis, to me, makes no sense. We know the standard of living in Russia has frozen and slipped since the war in Ukraine began, even when oil prices were high back in 2014. And I think this is another drain on Putin's political capital. and ultimate political support. But I do know that perhaps the most important of the sanctions relate actually to, it's not so much sanctions as tech control, the export of technology, dual-use technology, which may have military application. I think that's done some real damage to Moscow's arms industry, and thank goodness for that. I would also add one other thing, which is related to sanctions. You've got frozen Russian state assets to the tune of 300 billion approximately. We need to find a way to transfer those assets to meet Ukraine's economic needs. That would also decrease the pressure on the West to provide for those economic needs.
And allow me to link this to my last question from the audience before we let you go in a couple of minutes. As someone who knows Ukraine and its hardworking people and its potential really well, what is your opinion? There's a question on the business logic of supporting Ukraine. What if we stop worrying about handing down a certain number of billions of dollars and instead push companies to invest so the Ukrainians can manufacture things, they can manufacture weapons, they can pull themselves out of this with our help.
The problem here is that we don't have a command economy. We can encourage our firms to invest in Ukraine, but they'll make the decision. And a lot of very, very successful capitalists have pointed out that investment or funding is a coward. It abhors going to places where there's danger. So I don't think that's a solution, although certain measures could be taken. And I know that Penny Pritzker's thinking about this to enhance security in special areas in Ukraine, to permit rebuilding of industry and building of new industry, which would include FDI, foreign direct investment.
John, thank you very much. I know we need to let you go. I really appreciate your candid answers, because now obviously you're able to speak not in a diplomatic official capacity.
Correct.
I know you see those cards and applauding hands flying. John, you're always welcome to join us, not only online, but offline.
My pleasure. Mark, it's great to see you.
Thank you.
And good luck to your students. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.